let me share the screen. Okay, we can talk about hearing the last of it as a chapter which moves the plot a little further. We talked about the robbery, about Sparsit, about Bounderby and the Stephen, the incrimination, the suspects, and all these details. Now I think we will move to something, let's say, a little bit different than what we did in the previous chapter, in chapter 8. You see now, the chapter starts with Mrs. Sparsit lying by to recover the tone of her nerves in Mr. Bounderby's retreats. She moved to Bounderby's house. والreason كان because her nerves were disturbed. أعصابها تعبت because of the robbery, because of these events and the news of the robbery. So Bounderby suggested that Sparsit is to be taken, transported to his house, and to be took care of by his own wife, by Mrs. Bounderby, Louisa. So moving around, she will keep an eye on Louisa and what goes next. Of course, we know that Sparsit does not like Bounderby and does not like Louisa either. So she would try to manipulate, she would try to develop any kind of problems that are in her reach, that she can develop while she was staying in Bounderby's house. So these are the details related to her staying at Bounderby's house. I start here with a quotation: "An occasion I am sure not to be forgotten by myself in the course of ages," said Harthouse. So now we understand that at Bounderby's place, Sparsit, Bounderby, James Harthouse, and Louisa. Of course, Bounderby moves out for work and comes back again, where James and Louisa have enough time to spend together, to talk, to walk, and discuss many issues. Inclining his head to Mrs. Sparsit with the most indolent of all possible airs. "We live in a singular world, sir," said Sparsit. She is talking with James. "I have had the honor, by a coincidence of which I am proud, to have made a remark similar in effect, though not so epigrammatically expressed," etc. These details only show us who is present at this chapter. One point here shows that Sparsit does not like Louisa, does not like Mrs. Bounderby. "You found Miss Gradgrind? I really cannot call her Mrs. Bounderby." This is Sparsit talking. "شلون تسمي Louisa?" She does not address her as she is supposed to, Mrs. Bounderby, السيدة Bounderby. She says Miss Gradgrind. هذا المaiden name before her marriage, before Louisa's marriage. "It is very absurd of me, as youthful as I described her," asked Sparsit sweetly. "You drew her portrait perfectly," said Mr. Harthouse. "Presented her dead image. Very engaging," said Sparsit, causing her mittens slowly to revolve one over one another. This event shows that Sparsit does not like Louisa, and she would look for a chance to cause the separation between her and her husband. So when Mrs. Sparsit said with forced lightness of heart, "You want your breakfast, sir, but I dare say Miss Gradgrind will soon be here to preside at the table," and Bounderby replied, "If I waited to be taking care of my wife, ma'am, I believe you know pretty well I should wait till doomsday." Somehow he is mocking and being ironic towards Louisa, and he asked Sparsit to serve him his breakfast. يقولها إذا أنتظر لويزا تجي تجيب لي الريوق راح أنتظر إلى يوم القيامة. يعني this shows us that they are not in harmony. They are not. They do not understand each other very well. This point wanted to be made clear to us as the readers. Don't say that, sir, returned Sparsit almost with severity, because that's very unkind to Mrs. Bounderby. And to be unkind is not to be you, sir. Mrs. Sparsit tries to show herself as careful, as making some kind of concern, having concern toward Louisa, defending her. But of course we understand that she is totally the opposite. You may set your mind at rest, ma'am. You can take it very quietly, can't you, Lou? Said Mr. Bounderby in a blustering way to his wife. Of course, it is of no moment. Why should it be of any importance to me? Here we have this kind of argument started to accelerate, started to go further. You are incomprehensible this morning. لويزا بدها تحكي ويا زوجها. أنت ما مفهوم اليوم. شو بيك اليوم? Pray take no further trouble to explain yourself. I am not curious to know your meaning. What does it matter? A kind of strong reply to her husband. We look here at this highlighted red color. I made it in red in order to give you an idea that this needs to be understood carefully. But from this day, the Sparsit action upon Mr. Bounderby threw Louisa and James Harthouse more together. When Louisa gets further from her husband, there is a distance between them. Of course, at the same time, she gets closer to James, and strengthen the dangerous alienation from her husband. So Mrs. Sparsit's 2 or 3 lines earlier was somehow concerned toward Louisa and that her husband should not talk about her. But here, of course, she is developing this separation between her and her husband, and at the same time developing a kind of the relationship between James and Louisa. She had fallen by degrees so fine that she could not retrace them if she tried. But whether she ever tried or no lay hidden in her own closed heart. هذا الquotation refers to the development of the relationship between James and Louisa. Now they are closer than ever. It was a hasty note. Later, a note came to Louisa that Mrs. Gradgrind is very ill. She had never been well within her daughter's knowledge, but she had declined within the last few days, had continued sinking all through the night. So now, a news about Mrs. Gradgrind that she is dying. هذا فد kind of event that moves the plot further forward. A new note about Sissy, which we missed in the previous chapters. We don't know where is Sissy, what happened to her. The writer now gives some kinds of hints on Sissy and how she is adapting with the Gradgrind family. Sissy had never softened to again. هذا اللاين يشير إلى a relationship between Louisa and Sissy. You remember when Louisa accepted the marriage proposal by Bounderby, her relationship with Sissy came to a kind of a stop. They started to be far from each other after they were friends. So Louisa felt herself all unfit for Sissy. She had never softened to again towards Sissy since the night when the stroller's child had raised her eyes to look at Mr. Bounderby's intended wife. من ذاك الوقت مال أن أصبحت Louisa wanted to marry Bounderby. She went with a heavy, hardened kind of sorrow upon her into the house and into the mother's room. Louisa, since the time of her leaving home, Sissy had lived with the rest of the family on equal terms. She was at her mother's side, and Jane, her sister, now 10 or 12 years old, was in the room. So Sissy now is just like a member of the family. Well, my dear Mrs. Gradgrind, and I hope you are going on satisfactorily to yourself. It was all your father's doing. Now we need to highlight what Mrs. Gradgrind wants to say. It is all your father's deed. What was the father's deed? What did he do? He set his heart upon it. شنو هذا اللي لزق قلبه بيه؟ يعني شنو يرادي مستر Gradgrind الشيء اللي عنده وكان يحاول يسويه, and he wanted to keep it running in this family. Mrs. Gradgrind will make it clear here. I think there's a pain somewhere in the room, said Mrs. Gradgrind, but I couldn't positively say that I've got it. Aku pain, a problem in this room, but I don't know what is it. Louisa had observed her with her arm around Sissy's neck. Hi, sister, my Louisa, and she felt the difference of this approach. Sissy, my good girl. Sissy, hi, Mrs. Gradgrind, leave us alone a minute. So now we will understand what Mrs. Gradgrind want to say, and what she's gonna tell Louisa. You learned a great deal, Louisa, and so did your brother. Ologies. شنو ologies؟ كل نهاية مال علم. Psychology مثلا, zoology, geology. Ology يعني science. This is not an English suffix. Anything that ends with ology means a science of something. علم الكذا, علم الأرض, علم النفس, علم الدم, علم الكذا, علم الأمراض, إلى آخره. So this is related to the system according to which Louisa was instructed, which is the fact system. So you learned a great deal, Louisa, and so did your brother. Ologies, علوم of all kinds, from morning to night, الصبح لليل. If there is any ology left of any description that has not been worn to rags in this house, ماكو ology احنا فاتنا وما حكينا عنه. All I can say is I hope I shall never hear its name. اكو هو يعني اشياء درسناها هواي, بس اكو something missing. She says here, but there is something, according to Mrs. Gradgrind, not an ology. اكو فشي بس هو مو ology, مو علم. It is not an ology at all. Very different. That your father has missed. اللي الوالد يعني ما ركز عليه أو ما جابه للمدرسة مالته. Or forgotten, Louisa. I don't know what it is. I have often sat with Sissy near me and thought about it. I shall never get its name now. ما راح يجيني الاسم مالته. But your father may. It makes me restless, and I feel restless. I want to write to him to find out, for God's sake, what it is. Give me a pen. Give me a pen. And then, what does this say is that Mrs. Gradgrind at her deathbed, على فراش الموت, understand that there is something missing in the family, which is not facts. Of course, it must be the other side of life that is represented by the circus people, represented by the character of Sissy. And now she reminds Louisa with that thing that their father had missed in his school, and she dies at this chapter. Which man walked and disquieted himself in vain, took upon her the dread solemnity of the sages and patriarchs, a kind of reference to Miss Gradgrind, who would be removed from the novel, which represents her death. So this refers to the failure of the educational system, which is recognized by the very simplest character in the novel, here Mrs. Gradgrind, who had, let's say, no opinion, who had been very shallow, very simple character. She understood that something is missing and we need to reintegrate it in our system of education. So the chapter highlights these issues: Sparsit, her existence in Bounderby's house, and her negative role in developing the distance between Bounderby and his wife, and developing the closeness, the connection between Louisa and James. Louisa tried to keep James far, but Sparsit manages to create a kind of distance between her and her husband, which at the same time develops her relationship with James. Louisa and her mother, how she reacted towards her mother, and the mother's opinion and viewpoint towards the missing thing that we understand, اللي هو it is not ology. And Sissy is referred to in the chapter as a kind of important person who is now a member of the family, who took care of Gradgrind, Mrs. Gradgrind, and her daughters. These are the main events that we encountered in